I've spoken quite extensively on this podcast about how there are many ways that you can integrate computer science with other subject areas. But what about integrating computer science with ethics? What kind of frameworks might we use to explore that topic? Today's paper actually explores that. It's titled Integrating Ethics into Computer Science Education: Multi, Inter, and Transdisciplinary Approaches. This was written by Tristan Goetze. Here's the abstract for the paper. Quote, "While calls to integrate ethics into computer science education go back decades, recent high-profile ethical failures related to computing technology by large technology companies, governments, and academic institutions have accelerated the adoption of computer ethics education at all levels of instruction. Discussions of how to integrate ethics into existing computer science programs often focus on the structure of the intervention, embedded modules or dedicated courses, humanists or computer scientists as ethics instructors, or on the specific content to be included, lists of case studies, and essential topics to cover. While proponents of computer ethics education often emphasize the importance of closely connecting ethical and technical content in these initiatives, most do not reflect in depth on the variety of ways in which the disciplines can be combined. In this paper, I deploy a framework for cross-disciplinary studies that categorizes academic projects that work across disciplines as multidisciplinary, interdisciplinary, or transdisciplinary, depending on the degree of integration. When applied to computer ethics education, this framework is orthogonal to the structure and content of the initiative, as I illustrate using examples of dedicated ethics courses and embedded modules. It therefore highlights additional features of cross-disciplinary teaching that need to be considered when planning a computer ethics program. I argue that computer ethics education should aim to be at least interdisciplinary. Multidisciplinary initiatives are less aligned with the pedagogical aims of computer ethics, and that computer ethics educators should experiment with fully transdisciplinary education that could transform computer science as a whole for the better." End quote. If I were to summarize this article into a single sentence, I'd say that this article unpacks 3 approaches to integrating ethics with computer science education. Now, this article is talking about ethics in relation to higher education, computer science education. I'm going to talk about this in relation to K-12 computer science education. Now, I come from a background with having worked with every single grade, kindergarten through doctoral students in a variety of contexts, and having designed professional development and curricula that's been used by hundreds of thousands of students around the world, and teachers as well. So in episode 179, which was titled "This Applies to the Real World, Student Perspectives on Integrating Ethics into a Computer Science Assignment," we talked about how some undergraduate students gave some feedback on an ethics assignment in a higher education course. And I talked about how that might relate to K-12 education for computer science educators who are interested in including ethics. But one of the things that I talked about is that there are many ways that you could integrate ethics into computer science education. So this paper is specifically going to focus on that. Now, you can find a link to this paper in the show notes, which is at jaredoleary.com, or by clicking the link in the app that you're listening to this on, as well as a bunch of other computer science education resources. Like, this is episode 180 of the CSK8 podcast, but there's a bunch more content on my website that's related to computer science education, as well as a bunch of gaming and drumming stuff, because I'm a full-time content creator. So if you haven't been to my website yet, check it out. Just search for my name or go to jaredoleary.com. Now, in the introduction, the author mentions on page 645, quote, "Terms like multidisciplinary, interdisciplinary, transdisciplinary, and so on are often used interchangeably, without reflecting on differences these concepts might capture, and without explicit reflection on how the different disciplines in question are to be integrated. By fixing the meaning of these terms in place, we can see more clearly the particular advantages and challenges of multiple approaches to computer ethics education, and even imagine new ways of doing so." End quote. I totally agree with that. One of the problems that I ran into when I was doing my dissertation is there were so many different ways to kind of explore these intersections of multiple disciplines or domains. Some might call it cross-disciplinary or interdisciplinary or multidisciplinary, transdisciplinary, etc. There's also other types of integration like pluridisciplinary or metadisciplinary or an interdiscipline, or looking at it from frameworks such as like embedded thematic integration, knowledge integration, or even learner-initiated integration. All of these kind of like work together and kind of like muddy the waters of what it looks like when two domains in some way intersect with each other. This might be like a Venn diagram where only a little sliver is kind of intersecting, or it might merge all the way over into like an interdiscipline where they create a new discipline, or transdisciplinary where it just kind of like blurs many different disciplines together. So we're going to kind of unpack these and talk about it in relation to the intersections of ethics and computer science education. So in section 2, the author talks about some of the goals of computer ethics education. So here's a quote from page 646, quote, "1. Be familiar with their own ethical values, those of the computing professions, those of their society, and the variety of value systems that exist in the world. 2. Be able to analyze and produce ethical arguments. 3. be able to describe the positive and negative ways in which a variety of computing technologies impact the environment, individual group, and groups of people, especially marginalized groups. 4. Be able to identify the values and assumptions embedded in a variety of technologies. 5. Be familiar with the values, codes, and standards of professionalism expected of a computing practitioner. End quote. So graduates of a computer science program should be able to do that, according to this kind of framework. Now, I would argue that these could kind of serve as like big ideas that could help guide conversations of ethics in K-12 education as well. But how you explore these different broader ideas or questions or topics, etc., depends on the goals of your program, of yourself, of your students, various stakeholders, etc. So section 3 of this paper talks about different cross-disciplinary typologies that might be used when exploring this intersection. And so the author begins by kind of talking about how there are many ways that you can do this. So it's like a continuum of how much this will kind of intersect on the different Venn diagrams. If we only focus on ethics and computer science education, it could be just a one-off little intersection. It could be like an entire unit, it could be an entire semester or a course, or it could be an entire degree on just the intersections of ethics and computer science. And there's many different varying degrees in between each of those little examples that I gave. But let's talk about the 3 different cross-disciplinary typologies that are mentioned in this particular article. So here's a quote from page 646. Quote, multi- and pluridisciplinary work juxtapose multiple disciplines, where the former puts seemingly disconnected disciplines together, such as history and mathematics, and the latter juxtaposes disciplines that appear to have some affinity, such as French and Latin. Interdisciplinary work, by contrast, requires interaction between the disciplines through the distinctive concepts, methods, results, data, and so on. Finally, transdisciplinary work provides a meta-framework of concepts for understanding different disciplines from the perspective of philosophy or sociology of knowledge, end quote. And so the author mentions that there is kind of like a bit of a hierarchy there, in that multi- and pluridisciplinary are kind of like the lower levels of integration, and then interdisciplinary is kind of like the step up from that, and then transdisciplinary can be like an end result of like moving beyond disciplines or beyond silos in general. Having also explored a variety of like integration work, which I do link to in the show notes, there are several episodes that talk about integration. I will say that there's not a consensus on how each of these different methods or typologies are defined within the field of curricular studies. So while one author might describe multidisciplinary one way, another might describe it a different way. So section 4 of this paper is titled A Cross-Disciplinary Framework, and so it kind of outlines the 3 different approaches that are unpacked here. So I'm going to read off a paragraph that kind of unpacks each one of these and kind of talk about them after the fact. So this is from page 647. Quote, a multidisciplinary collaboration involves researchers who work in parallel or sequentially from discipline-specific bases to address a common problem. In these collaborations, researchers from different disciplines recognize that they have a common interest in some subject of research and would mutually benefit from multiple inquiries from different disciplinary approaches. However, each researcher or team engages independently in the inquiry from within their own disciplinary context, using their discipline's methods, background knowledge, and conceptual frameworks, reporting their findings to their collaborations in other disciplines only after their own work is complete. The inquiries happen either in parallel or sequentially, with one discipline's experts handing off the results to the next, end quote. Now, one way that I've heard multidisciplinary described is kind of like how a high school is set up, where you go to different classes and you are learning all these classes in parallel with each other, but they don't necessarily intersect. So one of the things that could be done to kind of like create the more of the intersection with multidisciplinary is to kind of have a theme across the different classes that are kind of explored. So I'm going to go explore the theme of like the Harlem Renaissance from an arts perspective. Then I'm going to explore it from a historical or sociological perspective. And then I'm going to explore it from, I don't know, like a science perspective, whatever. That might be all disconnected. And then maybe you'll bring it together at the end through some kind of culminating project, but not necessarily the case depending on how you define multidisciplinary. Now, this approach to multidisciplinary contrasts with interdisciplinary, which again is also discussed on page 647. Quote, an interdisciplinary research project involves researchers who work jointly but still from discipline-specific bases to address a common problem. In contrast with multidisciplinary research, interdisciplinary collaborations require all disciplinary experts to work on the same project instead of pursuing discrete inquiries. In doing so, however, each disciplinary expert or team still employs their own discipline's methods and conceptual frameworks. As in multidisciplinary research, experts from different disciplines might work sequentially, one discipline's findings being reported to the next. But instead of being essentially separate inquiries on the same subject that are brought together only at critical milestones in an interdisciplinary collaboration, every stage of work informs the next, regardless of its disciplinary home, end quote. So this might be a kind of project where you actually collaborate with another teacher. So for example, you might be collaborating with a science teacher, and you're going to create some kind of like device that's going to measure the, I don't know, soil temperature and weather, blah, blah, blah. If students are working on that same project in both your computer science class and the science class, or maybe you're like an elementary teacher who teaches both simultaneously, that might be an example of interdisciplinary research or an interdisciplinary project. So that overlap on the Venn diagram is much stronger there. But then we can get rid of the whole idea of silos to begin with if we explore transdisciplinary, which again is talked about on page 647. So here's a quote from there. Quote, "A transdisciplinary research project involves researchers who work jointly using a shared conceptual framework, drawing together discipline-specific theories, concepts, and approaches to address a common problem. In a transdisciplinary project, the collaboration extends beyond contributing to the same project using discrete disciplinary methods. The nature of the project requires integrating at the level of the conceptual framework and methods used in order to address a complex subject. In the process, a distinctive approach may emerge that could become a new discipline itself, such as a rapprochement of philosophy, psychology, neuroscience, computer science, linguistics, and other fields that produce the discipline of cognitive science," end quote. Okay, now again, because there are many different ways of conceiving of these like cross-disciplinary approaches and whatnot, the way I've heard like interdiscipline and transdisciplinary is a little bit different than what was described here. And this is not a knock on the author by any means. So when I explored the intersections of computer science and music making in chiptunes for my dissertation, we were looking at this like online discussion forum. There's like 10,000 members, like 11 million words of data, something like that. And they were making music with old retro video game consoles, hardwares, etc. In order to do that, they had to engage in computer science practices, explore different concepts, etc. Like to be able to modify the hardware or even design and create new hardware, or to just be able to like reprogram old hardware to be able to like perform with like a Sega Genesis or Mega Drive as an instrument in a modern computer or laptop, whatever. If we were to look at this from like a problem-based approach, it would be transdisciplinary in that the problem is people wanted to be able to make music with hardware that previously was not designed to be able to make music. So the way they did that was exploring like electrical engineering, exploring programming, exploring visual arts practices, also engaging entrepreneurial practices. Like they explored all these different ways to be able to do that. This could be described as transdisciplinary in that they are exploring a problem without thinking of disciplinary silos, but thinking of how to be able to solve the problem using whatever concepts, practices, etc. that they could come up with or find. So if you focus on the problem, it's transdisciplinary. But if you focus on that intersection, that merging of computer science and music to be able to create chiptunes, that might be an entirely new interdiscipline of chiptunes. So the way that I can kind of conceive of an interdiscipline versus transdisciplinary is more of a verb. It is a process that you engage in when you are exploring a problem or different practices, etc., from many different fields. Whereas an interdiscipline is more of a noun, where it is like the new thing, the new discipline that is a merger of former disciplines. So for example, like bioengineering is a merging of biology with like engineering. Or bioethics, which is a merger of biology and ethics. Those, in my opinion, are interdisciplines. Now that I've nerded out on those three different ideas, let's talk about how we can use them to kind of explore the intersections of ethics and computer science. So in section 5, multidisciplinary computer ethics, the author unpacks, well, what would ethics look like from a multidisciplinary perspective? Here's a quote from page 648. Quote, "A multidisciplinary computer ethics initiative integrates ethical education in parallel or in sequence with technical instruction, but keeps these disciplines separate within the degree program as a whole. Ethical concepts and skills are taught separately from technical concepts and skills, and they are brought together only at key milestones in the course of the study. Ethics is treated as something that can inform and improve technical computing work, but not as essential to the work of computing per se," end quote. So the author unpacks many different ways that you might be able to explore this within a computer science class. So for example, like an assignment that might have like a little connection with ethics. Like, okay, so you're going to program this thing, but also think about the ethical implications of the results on users or whatever. Could be a single assignment like that. It could be like an entire unit, but it could also be like an entirely separate course that is specific to ethics. Maybe it's just a broad ethics course course or a course that's specifically on computing ethics or ethics in computer science. But again, it is disconnected from all of the other classes or all the other degree work. So as we talked about in last week's episode 179, this is an approach that you could also use in your K-12 classes as well. You could have a class, a unit, a semester, etc., that is specific to ethics and computer science, or as simple as a single assignment that does that. Now, the author notes that this approach has an advantage in that it is relatively easy to be able to add this into existing technical curricula, but there are some disadvantages to this. So here's a quote from page 648 that unpacks that. Quote, "These approaches fail to take on Miller's insight that technical and ethical issues are best taught in connection with one another, rather than separately. This artificially isolates subjects that, in the professional world, always co-occur. Computing always takes place in social context, and ethical issues arise in connection with specific aspects of technical computing work." And a little bit further down, "Multidisciplinary computer ethics education risks presenting ethics as supplemental to the real world of computer science, namely the technical skills, with the bulk of the curriculum dedicated to technical instruction independent of ethics instruction, and ethics interventions limited to one-off courses or assessments. Students are often given the impression that ethics is an afterthought, burden, or box to tick." End quote. I really appreciate the author's framing of this in terms of both what are some of the advantages and disadvantages, or the affordances and constraints of such an approach. Again, as I mentioned many times, I like to focus on multi-perspectival approaches to education. There are many ways of doing things. So we will look at something like multidisciplinary computer ethics and go, this works, this does not. But let's talk about the next potential way of integrating, which is in section 6, interdisciplinary computer ethics. This is from page 648. Quote, "A closer integration of ethics and computing education would produce an interdisciplinary program, where both disciplines are taught concurrently in service of the same shared goals. Each discipline remains distinct in the concepts, background, and skills that they bring to bear. That both sets are used by instructors and students to engage with the same material. In interdisciplinary computing ethics education, ethics is a skill set that is presented as a requirement for doing quality work in the computing professions, despite being different in kind from technical skills. Interdisciplinary computer ethics is perhaps easier to achieve in the context of ethics modules, which are taught in the midst of ongoing technical courses." End quote. Now, the author talks about advantages in terms of it makes it so that when you're exploring both the ethical and the technical at the same time, you are trying to unpack the impacts of computing from the programs that you are creating or the hardware software you are developing. But again, the author notes that there are some disadvantages to this approach. It can require faculty members to be able to have an expertise in both computing and ethics, or collaborating with other people who have expertise that they don't have. It can also take more time. Like I mentioned previously, a boot camp approach is very different than a broader CS approach, where in the boot camp you might just be learning one IDE, one programming language, for the purpose of just getting a job. So all you're doing is just coding all day long. Whereas computer science, you might actually explore more than just the technical and explore some of the ethics and the impacts, as well as the theoretical. And there's a continuum clearly in between those two. And the same thing applies into K-12 education as well. So again, are you going to focus on the technical, or are you going to focus on mainly the theoretical or the ethical? Or are you going to focus on somewhere in the middle? We'll talk about that a little bit more when I do my lingering questions and thoughts at the end of this episode. But again, it is difficult to explore these different intersections if you do not have subject area expertise in both domains. A reason why I am able to talk about with confidence the intersections of music and computer science education is because I have a background in both. So all my degrees are in music education, but then I've also taught computer science education and developed curricula, professional development, etc. for computer science educators. So because I have that experience in both domains, I can confidently go into an interdiscipline like chiptunes and be able to speak confidently about the concepts, practices, etc. that are within both domains and how they intersect or don't. Which is one of the things that many curriculum scholars don't talk about with integration is, well, what about the stuff that doesn't fit neatly within that little shared space in the Venn diagram? What about everything outside of that? But I've talked about that, ranted about it in other integrated podcast episodes linked in the show notes. Okay, so interdisciplinary sounds cool. It's beneficial from a student perspective, but it's a little bit harder from an instructor perspective. The author next unpacks in section 7 the transdisciplinary computer ethics. What does that mean? So here's a quote from page 649. Quote, "The prefix trans in transdisciplinary suggests that such a project transcends the conventional divide between the disciplines involved, going over and beyond their limitations and perhaps creating a new field of study better equipped to tackle some range of problems. For example, one way to interpret the emergence of cognitive science and of science and technology studies as distinctive fields is that the various disciplines studying the mind and the social aspects of technoscience, respectively, came together to create new concepts, methods, and theories that could not be produced within their progenitor disciplines. Similarly, we might wonder what may emerge if ethics and computing were to become so closely integrated as to produce a new discipline of research and education. Transdisciplinary work requires that practitioners in multiple disciplines use their distinct expertise to craft a new conceptual and methodological framework to tackle a shared inquiry, end quote. Now, a little bit further down on page 649, the author further emphasizes an important point that I think we should also consider in K-12 education. Quote, a transdisciplinary approach to computer ethics would make ethical success at least as important as technical success in computing generally. On this approach, ethical reflection is no longer a supplemental consideration as multidisciplinary interventions positions it, nor is it an aligned but still alien skill set as it is positioned by transdisciplinary initiatives. Rather, on a transdisciplinary vision, ethical reflection is a core skill for computing, as important as other specialized areas of computing practice. A technological innovation would not be considered technically sound unless it is also ethically responsible to deploy. The conceptual frameworks are not just running in parallel, they have merged, end quote. Yeah, so again, another way that you can think of this, like if you think of it as the noun, that would be the interdiscipline, the intersection of computing and ethics as a new discipline to explore. If that is something that you are interested in, cool, you could totally do that. Another way of thinking of this is like broader than just ethics, but also social justice, which is obviously very related to it, is looking at like what does a socially just computer science education program look like? Or as like the K-4 Center's framework, culturally responsive sustaining computer science education program. What does that look like? How do you merge those together? Like those different perspectives from like scholars like Geneva Gay, Gloria Ladson-Billings, Harrison Leem, etc., which I've talked about in some other episodes. And I'll link to that in the show notes. For example, episode 40, which is titled Toward a Theory of Culturally Relevant Pedagogy. So the author provides multiple examples of, well, what would this kind of look like in a higher education context? I'm not going to read them off because, again, I want you to read this article. I think it's very interesting, and there's a lot of applications that could be relevant to K-12 educators as well as higher education. But there are some problems with this. And while there are many advantages in terms of being able to explore things from a holistic manner, not having disciplinary silos, etc., like the problems, again, with having the expertise in multiple domains, maybe not even just two domains, but several domains, it becomes harder from an instructional standpoint and from a preparation standpoint. But if you listen to the podcast episodes that I talk about on rhizomatic learning, or even like the affinity space characteristics episode that I link to in the show notes, that kind of gives you an idea of how you might explore from a transdisciplinary standpoint, or even design curricula from a rhizomatic standpoint that supports transdisciplinary learning, even if you are required to do standards in your K-12 classes. So if you want to dive down that rabbit hole, make sure you check out the links in the show notes. In particular, check out episode 150, which is titled Fostering Intersectional Identities Through Rhizomatic Learning, as well as a panel discussion for episode 75, Rhizomatic Learning with Catherine Bornhurst, John Stapleton, and Katie Henry, whereas the first episode kind of talks more of a curricular standpoint. The second episode that I just mentioned, that panel discussion, talks more of like a pedagogical approach. But then you can also explore episode 89, Applications of Affinity Space Characteristics in Computer Science Education, which kind of talks about how to design a class and facilitate a class that kind of supports this ability to explore many domains or interests simultaneously. But this kind of approach can be difficult, especially if you have like a lot of administrative pressures from different stakeholders and whatnot in terms of what they expect students to be able to do and learn within your classes. Are they expecting everyone to come out with the same understanding? Are they expecting students to focus just on the technical rather than on a broader understanding of computer science and its impacts of computing? Now, the last quote that I want to read from page 650 kind of gives you an idea of what it might mean to be successful if somebody were to go through some kind of a transdisciplinary computing ethics course or degree or whatever. Quote, a transdisciplinary computer ethics education program would be successful were it to reliably produce experts in computer ethics and experts in other subfields of computing, each of whom have enough complementary technical or ethical knowledge to be interactional experts with the others. A certain baseline level of ethical skill would be expected of all, but there would remain an important role for computer ethics specialists, whose backgrounds might be subdivided further into those who focus on philosophy, social science, area studies, or stakeholder engagement, end quote. Now that really resonates with me. So again, if you're going to like merge together and really focus on like ethics in computing or social justice in computing, etc., or equity in computing, however you want to think of this, like those different categories that all kind of resemble and blur together and diverge in different ways. In each one of those, you have the ability to dive deeper into different avenues. Like if we look at the LGBTQ umbrella, so like as somebody who's in that who is pansexual, I could look at it from like a sexuality perspective and dive deeper into that. I could also look at it as somebody who's non-binary and look at the issues around trans rights, etc. Those are two very different directions that I could specialize and go into within the LGBTQIA plus umbrella, etc. So whenever thinking of ethics, think not only of the macro, but also the micro in terms of like what are the different subdomains or subfields within the broader areas of ethics that could be explored within a classroom or within a particular assignment. Now, that might not necessarily be something that you have to come up with. Like if you think back to episode 179 that released last week, you could have students come up with their own little explorations within a broader topic or even like a smaller topic and specifically find a niche that they are interested in exploring within that domain. Now, at the end of these Unpacking Scholarship episodes, I'd like to share some lingering questions and thoughts. So one of them is, how might we communicate and develop shared understandings of the integration of computer science and ethics? So for example, what about students, admin, parents, etc., who think that computer science programs or classes should focus on the technical rather than the explorations of ethics or social justice or equity? How do we communicate the value of exploring that and the long-term impact not only for the individuals taking those classes, but for society as a whole? And how do we develop that shared understanding to say, look, your goals will be met as well as the goals that I am putting forward or designing into this unit or class or assignment or whatever. Just like I've mentioned in the other integration episodes, there are many different ways of conceiving of things or talking about things. But if you come into a computer science class and say, we're going to explore computer science, well, one person envisions in terms of is only going to focus on the technical versus your own, which might focus on like the technical and the ethical. That is something that needs to be communicated. So that way there is a shared understanding of going, yes, I see what you're doing here. So if an administrator walks into your class and goes, why are you talking about ethics? You should be learning how to program. You can confidently say, hey, we're learning how to program while talking about ethics, or however you end up embedding it within the classes that you work with. Another question that I have is, what other frameworks might we utilize when exploring the intersections of computer science and ethics? So as I mentioned at the start of this episode, there's other areas as well as like pluridisciplinary, metadisciplinary, cross-disciplinary. There's the embedded, thematic, knowledge, learner-initiated, etc. forms of integration. There are many different ways of conceiving of how people kind of create that Venn diagram between domains or disciplines. And I'm sure there are plenty that I'm not thinking of that fall within those little categories or types that I listed off that might be beneficial or might be useful for the field. Now, what we could do is look in other domains to see, okay, well, how does social studies like envision what integration might look like with other domains? Or what do the arts look like? But when we end up exploring those integrations, we have to think back to the things that I mentioned in episode 123, which is titled The Subservient, Co-Equal, Effective, and Social Integration Styles and Their Implications for Computer Science. Quite the mouthful. But it's an important episode to think through. Are we doing this in a way that makes one domain subservient to another domain? If so, that could be problematic. So if you haven't listened to that episode, again, 123, I highly recommend taking a look at that. So in a little mini series on integration, like episode 125 and episode 126, Images of Curriculum and Contemporary Venues of Curriculum Inquiry, I'll kind of like dive deeper into some things to consider when doing integration. But a final question that I have after reading this is, when is there too little or too much of ethics in computer science? So each educator that you work with, or yourself, every student you work with, every class, degree, etc., however macro, micro you want to think of this, might have a different answer to when there is too little or too much of ethics in computer science. It's important for you as an educator or as like a curriculum developer to think through what you intend for the saturation point to be when it comes to that intersection of ethics and computing, or social justice and computing, or equity in computing, whatever variation you want to think of. Sitting down and thinking through and being intentional with that saturation point, this is going to be where I'm aiming for in terms of a benchmark with each student or anyone who uses the lessons that I create or whatever. It's important for you to think through that in advance, so that way you can design for it, if you actually intend to integrate computing and ethics. I do highly recommend taking a look at this article. I also recommend taking a look at all the podcasts that are linked within the show notes at jaredoleary.com. But thank you so much for listening to this episode. If you have any questions, feel free to leave a comment on the YouTube video, and maybe share this and other episodes with other educators who might enjoy listening to this. Stay tuned next week for another episode. Until then, I hope you're all staying safe and are having a wonderful week.